Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dimitris Bouris, and I'm a Monnet Chair and an Associate Professor at the University, at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And it is in the framework of the Jean Monnet Chair called ATHENA. The name of the chair is inspired by the Greek goddess of war and wisdom, that we're doing this session today, this series called Meet the Researcher series. The chair as such focuses on the multiple security crises which have led to increased attention to the EU's role as a global actor. And some of the questions we try to tackle are: how can the EU become a more effective global actor and contribute to international peace and security? Although I'm the chair holder, I'm doing this work with my colleague, Dr. Olga Burliuk, who is also a senior researcher in the chair. And what we're trying to do with the chair is to create a spirit of interdisciplinarity among students, academics, and stakeholders, the public and policymakers, with the purpose of generating cross-cutting knowledge that will hopefully enhance awareness of EU affairs. The aim of this particular series of Meet the Researcher series is for our students and for the people who will eventually be watching this on YouTube to have the opportunity to get insights from well-established colleagues researching different aspects of the EU's role as a global actor, on how they conduct their own research, why they chose to become academics, what approaches they use in their own research, what case studies they use in their own research, and overall, what kind of questions guide their research. And I'm very happy that we have two amazing colleagues with us today who have built the field as well, and very prominent researchers. Professor Roberta Guerrina, who is a professor at the University of Bristol, prior to taking on the role of the director of the Gender Research Center in the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies, she worked at the University of Surrey, where she was university lead and director for equality, diversity, and inclusion, as well as professor and also Jean Monnet Chair in gendering EU studies. Roberta's work examines how gender norms and structures influence EU politics and policies. She has published widely on these topics and on gender mainstreaming in foreign security policy, as well as also feminist research methodologies. And we also have with us Dr. Laura Chappell, who is a senior lecturer in European politics. Laura holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham and also a master's in European studies from the University of Birmingham as well. She is the author of Germany, Poland, and the Common Security and Defense Policy, Converging Security and Defense Perspectives in an Enlarged EU. And she has also published widely on different aspects related to the EU's common security and defense policy, Polish and German defense policies, as well as gender and European security. She's also the co-editor of the European Security Journal, which brings us very often together, and it's a pleasure working with Laura. As I mentioned, Roberta and Laura have really done instrumental work on issues of gender, security, and more specifically, EU security and defense policy. And I would like to take you both back to your PhD years. And the first question which I would like to ask you both is, first of all, what led you to pursue a PhD? Why you decided to enter into the PhD and into the academia? And also, if you could tell us a little bit more about what your PhDs were about, what made you research the particular topics, and what kind of methods you used in your PhD. So let's start with Roberta. I don't know.
Dimitris, thank you for those questions, and actually taking me back to my PhD, which of course I only finished last year. So in terms of getting back to why I did the research that I did, and actually it's because of Cynthia Enlow that I did the PhD that I did. When I did my master's, I was introduced to her book, Banana Speeches and Bases. And within that book, the first edition of that book, there is a vignette that she describes about migrant women farm workers in Portugal. And I just found that really quite interesting. And I started doing a little bit more reading about the role of the European Union as a gender equality actor, which at the time was not particularly well-researched topic. And I decided to do my dissertation, my master's dissertation, on the evolution of gender equality policies in the European Union. So from the Treaty of Rome through to the equality directives. And then I thought, actually, there is a really big gap, because one of the things that was largely under-researched at that particular point was the impact of the 1992 Pregnant Worker Directive on maternity rights across the EU. And in the best kind of feminist ethic and feminist curiosity kind of tradition, I guess. I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time, but I was really drawn to the topic because I am the child of a single mother who raised me on her own in Italy in the 1970s. And one of the things that she kept reminding me of was that she didn't have any maternity rights when I was born, and she had to go back to work 2 weeks after I was born. So the topic just really intrigued me. What I learned after is that for all of us, there is a little bit of ourselves in the research that we do, or certainly in the way that we actually become curious in a particular topic and we enter that particular field. So for me, it is really about my roots, my origins, which is also then no surprise that the two case studies I selected to do for my PhD were Italy and the UK. Incidentally, there were also excellent case studies because they both objected to the introduction of the Pregnant Worker Directive, but for very different reasons. So actually provide a really good entry point for thinking about what I called at the time welfare regimes. But actually, if I was to go back and redo the work now, I would very much embedded within the work of Wolby on gender regimes. So that's one of the things that I would really revisit in terms of the work that I did. And it's not to say that I'm not going to revisit it, because I think issues around pregnancy rights, maternity rights are becoming interesting again, mostly because the questions around parental leave that are being raised, even though they're cast in very gender neutral terms, I think are deeply gendered, and they're still very much about allowing women, and here in a very binary kind of way understood, which is the way that the EU understands gender anyway, is to allow biological women to be both carers and workers. And that opens up a whole different set of questions, which we were not even close to asking in the 1990s when I started my PhD and when I completed my PhD. So that's kind of where I went. And in terms of methodology, you'd be happy to know that in those days, nobody really asked about methodologies, which is not necessarily a good thing. I actually think it's really good that we have much more methodological rigor in the way that we are approaching our research, both qualitative and quantitative. And I think to think about the rigor is of importance, especially to qualitative researchers. But if I think back, the main kind of methodological approach was process tracing and case studies.
Thank you so
Laura,
much.
over to you.
Thank you so much, Roberta. Lots of food for thought, but I want to allow Laura to respond to the same question, and then I'll come back with more questions.
Thank you, Dimitris. So I guess for me, my interest sort of developed as I went through undergraduate and partly my master's degree as well. I think what you take in modules does help to shape your interests as well as partly reflect them in terms of your choices in the first place. So really, I became interested in two things. The first in general was security and defence, particularly in the context of EU foreign policy. And the second element was EU enlargement, partly because we part of ourselves is in our research, and in ancestral terms, I'm part Central European as well. So that also, I think, helped to shape, where I went in terms of my interests. So really, my PhD basically put these two areas together initially. I mean, I gradually moved away from EU enlargement per se, but kept the focal point on Poland and Germany. And I often get asked, as I went to all these graduate conferences, why did you choose Germany and Poland? It was like the first thing I would ever get asked. And really, I think if you think about the sort of emphasis on enlargement, Poland has the largest security military force of the Central East European countries, so the new entrants. And it was being asked to do more, right? There was a certain expectation placed on Poland, particularly after, of course, it joined NATO as well. And in a way, we see this also with Germany, right? The Germany obviously has been a motor in terms of the EU integration. It's an economic powerhouse, but when it comes to defense, obviously it has restrictions on the use of force, and it wasn't always meeting the obligations that its allies wanted it to meet. So we had sort of two countries here which were being expected to do more, simply put, in the sort of security domain. And of course, geographically and historically, of course, there are, certain parallels between them. So, my focus really was on thinking about those two countries' security and defence policies in terms of continuity and change, but also convergence and divergence between them in the context of the role they played within the EU's common security and defence policy. And I use strategic culture because it has this historical element as part of the theoretical approach, right? It's about the interpretation of that historical experience and how that shapes countries' approaches towards the use of force. Why does Germany have restrictions on the use of force when, if you look at its, economic power, you would assume that its military power would match. And for this, we really have to go back to, of course, Second World War, 1945, Sturm Null, and the complete sort of sweeping away of a very militaristic strategic culture. And in its place, we have a strategic culture focused on this idea almost of Germany as a civilian power, with restrictions on the use of force, this idea of reflexive multilateralism. So, history matters in the same way that for Poland, history matters, right? If you look at a map of Poland through the last 200 years, right, at certain points, Poland is not on the map at all. Okay, so this obviously has an influence, on Poland's security and defense policy. We're seeing, of course, at the moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine that, Central and Eastern European countries who actually had a prioritization of Russia as a threat perception would simply not listen to. So I think for me, history matters in part. In shaping countries' approaches to security and defence. In terms of methods, I mean, Roberta is right insofar as there was less, sort of emphasis on methods, but it was still there. Certainly, when I did my PhD, I did a comparative case study for obvious reasons. I was looking at Germany and Poland. I also conducted semi-structured interviews, I think around about 54 in total. So that was really a sort of a mainstay of the underpinnings of my approach, at least anyway. But as you can see, of course, there was nothing on gender at that point in my research. So I'm sure we can come on to how I ended up having this gender sort of stream, if you like, within my research agenda.
Actually, this is what I would like to trace with both of you, your own evolution as researchers. And this is what I try to see, how from one thing you move to another. But before going to that, I would like to go back to Roberta. And you mentioned the 2000s. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sorry if I am, but I think that you were the first one, if not the first one, among the first scholars who started publishing on issues related to gender, mainstreaming, and the EU back in the 2000s. So you started publishing before completing your PhD, because you said that you completed a year ago. And I want to ask you something a little bit. I mean, it's personal, but also professional. How was it publishing on these topics in the early 2000s? And especially, how was it for a woman to publish in these topics in the early 2000s?
Oh, what a great question. So actually, I wasn't the first. The wonderful and amazing Catherine Hoskins was the first to publish in 1996 what I think is the kind of key text for opening this field. So she published with Verso a book entitled Integrating Gender, and she goes through the history. And I think it's really important to throw back to the work of Catherine Hoskins, as well as Elizabeth Meehan, Eleanor Kaufman. So when I started my PhD, there was, when I started my PhD, there was one special issue looking at this topic, and that was it. So it was a completely new field. And then Catherine published her book in 1996, which was very timely. It gave me 2 years to embed her work into my own thesis, which I would strongly advise you all to do if you're planning to ask someone to be your external examiner. So Catherine was also my external examiner, and publishing in the 2000 was actually, I mean, it was challenging, and it was also kind of really exciting because it's at the start of a subfield, if you wish, but also because it's a time in which the space is starting to be open. So through the work of people like Catherine, but also Cynthia Enlow, Marisa Zalewski in international relations, Anne Phillips in political science, to name but a few, Mika Bralou in European integration again as well. You have high levels of energy in terms of the contributions that you can make to this discipline. And that is both great, but also challenging, insofar as a lot of the work that we published in those early days, if you wish, is really quite limited and silos gender to gender equality policies. Now, I don't think that we could have done it any other way, insofar as we were asking the questions, and questions that for many people were not obvious. So I still remember some of my first presentations, people saying to me, like, what does this have to do with your international relations, right? What should we know about it? And also, especially because I was looking at the position of mothers, I was using theories coming from sociologies on the construction of mothering through the law. People are like, so what, right? Why should we know about this? I mean, so what does it tell us about the European Union? I mean, actually, I think it tells us huge amounts about the European Union. And there are great examples coming from this field that we can use to illustrate institutional politics in many ways, not least the Commission as a policy entrepreneur, right? The Pregnant Worker Directive is one of the best illustrations of that. But it was challenging insofar as it was difficult to get into mainstream journals, right? And I don't think things have gotten a huge amount better. So no, it's gotten a lot better in terms of getting into the journals, but it's not. But we still have a citation gap. So I'm currently co-editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies, and I was talking to one of our authors who is also coming to gender in the last to doing gender research in the last 3 years, and she's published an absolutely amazing piece on gender, on the masculinities of Brexit in our journal. And at the same time, she published a couple other pieces in different journals, lower ranking journals, which have nothing to do with gender. And one of the things that she's noticed straight away is that her citations for those pieces is very different. She would have expected higher citations from our output, our manuscript, but she's not getting that. So we still actually need to close the citation gap, which actually is important for people looking to be promoted. So we all look at citations when we look at applications for promotions and so on. So this is a real challenge. Now, what I like to think is that, I like to think that this is not going to happen now, but I actually heard that similar things have happened in the last 3 years. So there's still a lot of work to do. So when I just finished my PhD, I was looking to publish some of the chapters as articles in high-ranked journals, and I sent one of my manuscripts to one of the highest-ranked journals in our field, not JCMS, but one of the others. And the editor at the time replied to me saying, "Oh, this is a really good manuscript, really needs to get published, but I don't think it fits the scope of the journal." So this is a journal about policies in Europe, and my article was about European policies on maternity rights. But the best thing about it is that the letter then came to me also included a line saying, "Oh, and by the way, it's not that I'm not publishing it because it's about gender, because we published a special issue on gender last year. But I'm not even going to send it out for review." So I think those kind of challenges have become easier. I think editors know that they need to attract a wider range of scholarship. But it's still hard for feminist scholars to get into the mainstream journals. Not least because there is a whole new body of scholarship that is starting to emerge in the last 3 years, let's say 5, 6 years, which looks at gender, but very much from a variable perspective. And that fails to engage with the body of literature that has gone before. So many of these articles come to me often to review. And I'm like, that's great. I'm really happy that you're doing this. I don't mind you treating, well, I do mind people treating gender as a variable because I think it's flawed. But I don't, I also appreciate the value of methodological and theoretical pluralism. So that's not an issue. But you still need to engage with the literature that's gone before. Otherwise, you're reinventing the wheel and actually not pushing the knowledge, the expertise, the science, I guess, any further. And so that's kind of the big challenge, I think, that we still have. I don't know, Laura, you're also editor of a journal. So what do you think?
I think it has got better, particularly when you come to, I think journals are more open simply to a wider range of different theoretical and methodological approaches than they used to be. I mean, I've heard about, Roberta's issues with getting articles published on gender, earlier on in her career. I don't think those issues are as significant now as they used to be, but I do agree with Roberta that there is still a citation gap, and this partly relates to what do we see as the canon within the discipline, right? Which types of literature do we consider we need to reference, right, in order to ensure that we've ticked the box of saying that we've read the literature and we've cited the literature. And it's not just theories based on on gender theories, but also I think more broadly speaking sort of more critical theories as well have this challenge. But we need to really start to consider, as I say, what is the mainstream, what is the canon, and which arguments actually we do need to engage with, which are not usually or cannot be found in the mainstream, because there's a lot of excellent work being done on, talking about gender, on feminist theorizing, for example, and the application of feminist perspectives on different EU, policies. So we do need to engage with that research, whether we are writing, in my case, on utilizing feminist theories, or whether I'm writing, my work on using more sort of social constructivist mainstream theoretical approaches. I think it is, really key.
Thank you both. I agree with a lot of things you raised, and there are also things that we raise in our classes with our students about the publishing patterns, etc., etc. And although I do agree with you that things are better, they're still not great. But I do want to bring, I know that you have limited time, so I want to talk about the work that you have been doing together, actually, and ask a little bit what brought you to cooperate and to write together. I think it all started in 2013, but then it evolved in 2018 and 2020. And also see the evolution of how, for example, Roberta moved from the gender equality policies, the internal in the EU, to external relations, and also how Laura moved from looking at Poland and Germany to looking at gender and EU security as such, and understanding the gender regimes of the European External Action Service, for example, or transforming the common security and defense policy and the feminist triangles. So what led you to come together and write together on these topics?
BBC Radio 4, any questions would be the starting point, I think. And I don't know whether you know what BBC or Radio 4 Any Questions is, basically, but it's like on radio, it's a panel show where, you have like MPs or journalists, on a panel. And the audience, before you go in, you can write down questions, right? And then the producers will select the questions which they, want to be asked. So my question was chosen. And the context for it was, at the time, the US had just announced that women would be allowed to fight on the front line. So my question basically asked whether the UK should follow the US in allowing the same. So obviously I asked the question, and I wasn't very impressed, shall we say, with the responses that I received. I mean, they literally went from, well, women's role is, peace, and that's part of the social fabric of the country. Women shouldn't be fighting at all. So a very traditionalist perspective, all the way through to, well, I support women being able to fight on the front line, but, maybe they should be allowed to choose. And I just didn't think that that was highly logical, because if you're going to decide to be a soldier and you decide to go for positions in the British Army which enable you to fight on the front line, why would you then subsequently decide that you're not going to fight after all? It seemed to me that there was an issue about how women soldiers were seen, simply, that they couldn't get past the fact that women fight, right? We see this not only in state armed forces, but also, of course, in non-state armed forces, right, where we have women who are militarily engaged. So I wasn't very happy, and so obviously I was talking to Roberta about this, and that was where the idea for what was a blog at the time came from, and really was, I guess, the start of my sort of academic journey, I would say, into looking more substantively at gender within the common security and defence policy. So in a way, what I did was I kept the focal point of all my research, which is broadly speaking on EU security and defence, and I brought the gender angle into it, the gender lens with it into it, basically. don't know, Roberta, whether you want to say something.
Yeah, no, so after completing my PhD, I just started moving towards policy areas that were traditionally seen as gender neutral, gender free, based on the idea that there is no such thing as a policy domain that is free from gender or hierarchies of power. So, and that really kind of tells you quite a lot about the way that I understand this concept, or as an analytical framework. So for me, gender is not a categorization as such. It's not an identity. It can be an identity, but I don't treat it as an identity. I treat it as a structure of power. And in a way, I do that because it allows me to move beyond the binaries, but also use data that is collated by institutions and organizations that treats it as a binary, insofar as that data in itself provides us insight into an organization's understanding of what is gender and what work gender is doing. And also in terms of the identity piece and sexuality piece, the reason why they matter is because gender is a structure, and it's a structure of power that, you know, interacts with state structures and policies, which either reproduce or challenge hegemonic norms around gendered roles and gendered behaviors, right? But in that, it also allows us to look at intersectional issues and intersectional discriminations, which makes it different. So true to gender mainstreaming, I guess, which is one of the key commitments of the European Union, I thought, okay, let's move beyond the gender silo or the equalities silo to look at how this concept has actually been mainstreamed. And it just so happened that the 2008 crisis provided really good entry point for this analysis. So looking at crisis, looking at economics, and then security and defense are a clear kind of also useful entry point for this analysis. And I should say that in order to do that, I wouldn't want to come across as like I'm an expert in all of them. But what I think is really quite important is to understand what you bring to a project and to partner with people who have different skill sets, different expertise, so that you can actually bring innovation to the analysis. And this is where I think the real innovation comes at the moment in relations to different methodologies that you can bring to the table, different policy domains that we're looking at, the merging of different theoretical frameworks. So for instance, in my latest work, I'm using social network analysis and discourse social network analysis to look at how policy concepts diffuse through documents, debates, and discussions. I have tried to teach myself how to code in R. It was a fun 3 days of me feeling quite stupid. But I learned the basics, but I also learned that actually there are people who can do the same work that I can, that might take me about 3 days. They can do it in 2 hours. So I partner with people who can do that, right? Because they don't have the other bit of the knowledge that I bring to it. So we're doing really innovative work that draws on our skill sets, because we can't know everything at the same level. So kind of on the methodology side, I still think it's important for me to learn, at least to read the code, to understand if the syntax is right, so that I can spot mistakes. But I think I can leave it to those who are actually experts. And actually, to answer, Dimitris, can I just say something about the challenge you received from some of your colleagues? Well, I see myself as a social scientist. I always say I'm a political scientist, and science is key to that. And the reason for that is I'm not a positivist, definitely not a positivist. I dabble in some quantitative stuff, but again, I let my colleagues who are much better at it do the work in it. But the reason why I still think it's science is because we are contributing to the production of new knowledge, and that is science. So we're kind of going into the philosophy of science, right? And there is plenty of evidence, plenty of evidence. Now, without including those perspectives, and especially the lived experience of some people, and as an entry point for science, we're producing lower quality science, right? And if you need an example of this, have a look at the work by Caroline Criado Perez on Invisible Women, which highlights the harm that is caused by not looking at gender. As you know, as for instance, the fact that women or female health workers are more likely to suffer from long COVID and have had higher levels of mortality during the COVID years because of two reasons, right? They're mostly the nurses who are hands-on with the patients. Therefore, they are exposed to a higher viral load and mostly on the COVID wards. And second is because the PPE equipment was not designed to fit female bodies. And the same is true if you're looking at external affairs to do with body armor, right? The body armor that women soldiers are issued often does not fit female bodies. Therefore, they're more likely to suffer a serious injury or death once deployed. So this is about better science. It's science that actually work for the societies that are asking us to develop this kind of knowledge. So what I would say to them is like, it really is not about science. This is not scientific research. Of course it is, right? It's because otherwise you're missing a significant piece of the puzzle. And this is just about gender, and gender is still treated as a binary, right? And so there are huge exclusions that we're not even dealing with. So this is actually about having better knowledge.
Completely agree, Roberta. I know that you will need to leave in a bit, so I have a last question for both of you. I want to take you to your 2020 article, which you wrote together, Understanding the Gender Regime in the European External Action Service, which was published in Cooperation and Conflict. And I would like to delve a little bit more into this article and for you to tell us what the idea behind this article was, and what kind of methods you used, because I mean, I think we can all guess that you primarily use gender feminist research methodologies, but if you could delve a little bit more into this and give us some details of how students or people who will be watching this video eventually, how can they use this kind of methodologies?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we were interested really in looking at the European External Action Service because, you know, it is of the EU institutions, the newest institution. It's the institution that deals predominantly with foreign security and defence policy. And of course, the first two high representatives of that organisation were, of course, women. So, you know, it does lead to an interesting question around you know, not only symbolic representation, which Roberta and I are doing a subsequent article on, but also around, you know, gender equality within the EAS and gender mainstream within the EAS, right? So, you know, it was Catherine Ashton's job basically to create the EAS and obviously to set it up and get it going. But, you know, this leads into thinking, well, just because you have a high representative who's a woman, right, what does the rest of the organisation actually look like? And, you know, so within the article we had, I actually went and got the organogram and actually started to look at where are the women and where are the men within the European External Action Service. And actually, of course, what we found was, well, there weren't very many women in the higher echelons of the EAS, just the High Representative and then Helga Schmidt. And when you looked at, you know, things like the EU military staff, we're finding, of course, you know, the only women really there were predominantly in secretarial roles. So, you know, you have to really think about not just, you know, a tick box, how many men and how many women work within a particular organisations, but where they are, what jobs they are doing within that organisation. So that was really sort of our way in, if you like. But this led obviously into thinking about different types of gender regimes. So gender regime theorizing has predominantly been done within social policy, and not within security and defence. So obviously we took the sort of Sylvia Wolby's work as the starting point, but evolved that into and integrated it more into thinking about gendered norms within gender regimes, and what those are, and what we were seeing in respect to the European External Action Service. So yeah, it wasn't a, we found there was a lot of co-option of gender in order to fulfill other policy objectives, particularly those surrounding security. So it's not a, gender wasn't taken particularly seriously in certain instances. We found that gender was often assumed within human rights. So this silos gender rather than it being mainstreamed, which it should be across all different types of policy domains. So there are many different findings that we sort of highlighted in the context of the EAS and the integration of gender. And really, therefore, what we found was that the EU in this context is a gendered normative actor, which strategically employs a gender narrative rather than it being, a normative gendered actor, was really our sort of core finding. In respect to methods, well, the thing with feminist methodology, it's not just about the methods you use, right? Because the methods we use are not, particularly unique to, to feminist, research or to even mainstream research, right? We use qualitative content analysis, and we use semi-structured interviews, right? They're quite typical methods utilized, throughout political science and other disciplines. Really, I think feminist research is fundamentally about feminist curiosity, about thinking, again, this comes back to what Roberta was saying about, areas being seen or policies being seen as gender-free, right? No, there's no such thing as a gender-free policy area. And you really have to start to unpack power structures within policies which seemingly are gender neutral or gender free, in order to expose what the gender regimes are. So I think it's these types of questions that really make something feminist as opposed to mainstream. So we need to get beyond the methods that we utilize and think more about the questions that we ask when we think about gender research. I don't know, Roberta, whether you want to say anything.
No, all of that. The only thing that I would add is that methodologies evolve always, right? And they should. So one of the things that I think is worth noting about that piece that I actually subsequently really thought about is two things. One is how we assign gender to the people that we, when we looked at the organogram, right? And we assign gender also in a binary way, which we may want to actually think about going forward, but also we assigned it based on presentation. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have done the work that we did. We totally did. And it was really important work. However, what I think I will certainly do going forward is be clear in the way that we articulate our methodology, that this is one of the limitations, right? But we want to think about it in terms of descriptive representation and the symbolic nature of that. And that is done by looking at how people present in terms of their gender and the assumptions that are made about those individuals, about the way that they present. This is also true of the report that I've just done with Schluttmacher, where we looked at gender in the canon, right? Laura talked about the canon earlier. And again, we couldn't go and do a survey of all the authors and the people cited in the canon. But what we did do, we assumed gender based on names, based on presentation, based on our knowledge of the individuals, right? Again, limited, but this is about the start of that conversation, right? It's not about the end point. It's the start of a conversation that actually highlights some of the biases and in the way that the institution manifests, but also some of the ways gender as a structure of power manifest in the institution and the way that the institution projects its own identity. And that's really kind of the work that we're doing. On the issue of gender regimes, Laura is absolutely right as a theoretical framework and the evolution of it. But also I'd like to point this to the way that this theoretical framework has evolved, right? So Wolby now also talks about violence as a domain of gender regimes, which she hadn't done before. And what is interesting about that is I've had conversations with Wolby about this, and I keep saying to her that actually I don't think it's violence. I think it's security, right? The domain. And she would fundamentally disagree. She thinks there is a difference between security and violence. She locates it in violence, and it's part of a conversation. And the reason why I point this to you is because there is a really useful forum from 2021, I think, in which she opens it up as part of a conversation and a debate. And what I really liked about what Sylvia did is that she drew attention to the disagreements between colleagues, but you can see that as a really good example of how disagreement manifests itself in a conversation, in an academic conversation that is constructive rather than destructive. And I think you can really see the feminist ethic at work in the way that the debate and the discussion was taking place there.
Thank you so much. I know that Roberta has to leave, so we probably don't have time for questions. But I was wondering if Laura has 5 minutes for 1 or 2 questions from the student. You have. All right. Perfect. Are there any questions from anyone?
Just a very simple, short question. What is strategic culture? You mentioned it in the beginning, but I don't know what it is. So.
Okay. Any other questions now that? Yeah.
Could you maybe explain one of you more about the method of process tracing in short, possible?
If you could elaborate a little bit more on process tracing. Perfect. Any other questions? Yeah.
It's maybe not answerable because it's a very broad question, but have you also looked into possible solutions and ways to change European policies for them to be better?
It's a more normative question. I'll leave it to you to decide who wants to respond to what.
I'll do the strategic culture one because I define strategic culture as the beliefs, attitudes and norms held by a security community towards the use of force, which has had a unique historical experience. So this really underpins countries' approach to using force. So when with whom does the security actor use force is how I approach it.
All right, process tracing. So process tracing is a standard political science methodology that looks at how policies have developed. So you start with the outcome and you go back to see what were the critical moments and the critical actors that help to shape the policy the way it is. So I know when I teach it, normally I see process tracing as like an onion. You're kind of peeling back to see what was the core. Now, I think there are serious limits to process tracing insofar as it seeks to establish causality. So this actor came in, this happened, and this is why we have a policy this way. I actually think policies develop in a much more iterative way. There are some of the key developments are incidental and by chance. So critical actors have a role to play, but they're not. I think it's very difficult to infer causality in that. And on the question of the normative, how can we make policies better? Okay, I don't do my work if I didn't actually want to have, feminist work is based in an ambition for social justice and social change. Absolutely. At the same time, we are researchers. We can identify limitations. We should identify better ways of doing it, but ultimately, it's a political decision how you take it, how you change the law, how you change the policy, how you change an institution. It's a political decision. And we can advise, but unless we're actually part of the executive and we're part of decision-making processes and structures, in a way, it's not our job. Now, I know several colleagues of mine certainly at Bristol, who are much more activist in this kind of space, would not agree with me. But I think there is value to keeping a degree of separation between the work that we do, the advice that we give, and making decision makers accountable for it. But again, that kind of feeds into the work that Laura and I have also been doing on feminist triangles. So I would say this.
Perfect. Thank you both, first of all, for making the time to be with us today. I know how busy you both are. And secondly, thank you for this very insightful, informative, but also quite empowering, at least for me, quite empowering talk. So thanks a lot for being with us.
It's lovely seeing you all. And this is a great initiative.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.